Okay, well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Chris Fuller. I am the Chief Sponsorship and Mission Integration Officer at St. Joseph's College in Maine, in Standish, Maine, near Portland. And this is an event being sponsored through the Center for Faith and Spirituality. And each semester, I host a series of events through the center, and I try to make sure at least one of those events is something that will appeal to the Catholic community, especially here in Portland and in the Portland Diocese. And so tonight we have with us a special guest, and that person is Jon M. Sweeney, or John Sweeney. Jon is an award-winning author of several books on Catholic topics, including The Complete Francis of Assisi, Thomas Merton, an introduction to his life and practices, and a course on Christian mysticism. And I found that something Jon had written for American Magazine called In Search of the Catholic Novel. So that's why we have him here with us tonight, is to talk with us about what do we mean by that. In fact, I would say Catholic literature, because we've thrown Flannery O'Connor, you've got someone who writes mostly short stories, a few novels, but lots of short stories. What do we mean by Catholic literature? And who are some of the principal writers that we might associate with this field? So, Jon, thank you for joining us tonight.
It's my pleasure. I'm happy to be with you all.
So, I want to start, Jon, with something you actually wrote in that article. I think it's a good starting point for us to talk about what do we mean by Catholic literature or the Catholic novel. And you start the piece in American Magazine, you write, I sometimes think the most meaningful difference between Catholic novelists today and a half century ago is, well, very little. Those writers were not interested in being labeled with their religious tradition. Those writers were not interested in being labeled with their religious tradition, except for Flannery O'Connor, which we'll probably talk to in just a moment. Neither are Alice McDermott or Christopher Bea today. So let's start there. You would think by the title Catholic novel, you'd be talking about writers who are self-avowedly Catholic and probably writing books about priests and churches and nuns. But I don't think that's what you were describing, correct?
Well, I don't think that's what I was describing, but that is what most of us who are over the age of, 55, and who think about the loss of the Catholic novel. I mean, that's the way that the conversation is often framed. Is what happened to all the great Catholic writers, the great Catholic novelists? It used to be that Graham Greene and Evelyn Waugh were on the cover of Time magazine. Why don't Catholic fiction writers have that kind of influence in culture anymore? I think that kind of question is what really sparked articles like the one that I wrote, and there have been others. I mean, like Paul Ely wrote an article in one of the big magazines. I don't remember, the New Yorker or the Atlantic or something, a few years before I wrote that one in America, really sparking the beginning of this kind of conversation. It was almost a conversation centering around the loss of influence, Catholic writers and the influence over culture. That seems to be gone.
Mm-hmm. So what was it about those writers? What were they bringing to their work that was informed by their you point out that if you'd asked a number of them, and again, my area is cinema, it's very similar. Like if you asked certain filmmakers about being Catholic, they'd probably say that's not very important. But there are consistent kind of trait. John Ford was kind of like Flannery O'Connor, more self-avowedly Catholic. But others would probably dismiss it, and yet there's a consistent kind of, you could say, Catholic worldview that expresses itself. And you kind of point out with some of these writers just as well that they would probably dismiss the idea. Nevertheless, I think we could say that there is a consistency of a kind of approach or worldview. What was that existed that we're writing about today that perhaps has been lost or needs to be reclaimed?
Well, I don't know if it needs to be reclaimed. I don't know if it's actually reclaimable. So I'm rejecting the last part of your question.
Okay.
But I think what the environment was then was, what we sort of tentatively call the classical Catholic novel was flourishing in an era in which both the institutional church and individual Catholics were quite distinct from the society surrounding them. Um, that's some of that is a pre-Vatican II quality. Some of it, I think, is an ethnic quality. It was Irish or Italian or something in those days. These days, some Spanish-speaking Catholics maintain a little bit of that uh, separate identity from the culture that I'm referring to, but not like it was back in the day, particularly in Britain, which is where a lot of these great Catholic novelists came from, Graham Greene and Evelyn Waugh, and so on. That really was the headquarters of the great Catholic novelist in the 40s and 50s. Catholic life was quite outside the boundaries of Church of England and of English cultural life. And I don't think in the U.S. it was any more mainstream.
Mm-hmm.
But Catholics have become much less distinct from the surrounding culture and the surrounding neighborhood and the surrounding everything in the last 75 years. And I think a lot of that is by choice. And some of it, now we have more Catholics than Protestants on the Supreme Court, right? So these things have really swung in a way that were unthinkable 75 years ago. But I think that's part of it. Is that the Catholic identity was being maintained through this Catholic novel.
Mm-hmm. And what was that identity? What were the features of that kind of distinguishable identity of that time?
Well, I think there's a lot of ways to answer that. There's a literary criticism, a book of literary criticism that's written on this topic, and I remember the title of it is "The Vertical Man," and it's all about the vertical relationship with God and how that is a distinct part of the Catholic novel back in the day. And I think that that's true. I think it also involved a lot of sacramental reference, a lot of what we would think of as being quite churchy today. The Catholic novelist today does not get involved in a whole lot of insights into the sacraments, does not usually deal a lot with religious hierarchy or depict saints and things like that. But that's a lot of what was happening back in those classic days of the Catholic novel. A lot of discussion of sin and grace, falling from grace, examples of sin, sometimes a real, like in the French version of the great Catholic novelist. Um, I speak no French whatsoever, so I will butcher these names, but if I say them the way that you would say them in English, you'll know who I'm talking about. So Leon Bloy, that's not how you say it in French, but Bloy, or George Bernanos.
Yes.
Those two names, Diary of a Country Priest is Bernanos, and Bloy is a great novel, but depressing as all get out, called The Woman Who Was Poor. And these books had a big influence back in the middle of the 20th century, but they represent what I think of as a very old world way of portraying the Catholic faith in general. They present a very sort of degraded humanity, and by so doing, exalt the power of God and the power of grace upon someone's life. So God becomes glorified in direct proportion to human beings being vilified.
Mm-hmm.
So the woman who was poor, for instance, by Leon Bloy, it's I mentioned it's depressing. It's depressing is putting it mildly. It almost seems completely hopeless for the characters in the novel. But the point by the end is the grace of God, the incredible grace of God, and our having to throw ourselves upon the grace of God. So there's a way in which some of this worldview, I think, was feeding into that understanding of sin and grace and human beings' utter need of the divine in a way that just with a language that we don't use as much anymore. Our art of all kinds, and I'm sure this relates to film as well, but I don't know film, but I'm sure it relates to film too, that we've been infused with humanism in the last 75 years in a way that was not present before that time. So we have no trouble now talking about God and talking about faith and talking about even things like sin and grace with language that allows us to see how we might become better, and how there is new life, and there is conversion and turning away and seeking joy and love and light. We don't have to kind of remain in the darkness in order to understand that God exists. So I don't know. That might have been a little bit rambling, but that's kind of my way of looking at sort of the old world view of the Catholic novel and how things have kind of changed.
That's interesting. Yeah. So when you say that, I do think of Diary of a Country Priest, right?
Yes,
A story that is, for all intents and purposes, about a priest who is a failure.
yes,
Um, any number of Flannery O'Connor's stories. The Power and the Glory,
yeah.
right?
Same with
Yes.
this one. Yep, yep.
Yeah, The Power and the Glory, about a priest who is effectively a sinner for all intents and purposes, right? All of these have this consistent theme, if you will. I hadn't put that together, but I think you're absolutely correct. So, is there anything about um, contemporary Catholic novelists like Alice McDermott, but your essay in particular was about um, Giraldi, right? Was looking here quickly
Well, yeah,
at
that was a new book at the time. Yep.
yeah, and there's Cormac McCarthy. It's interesting you say that. When I move over to film, I think similarly. There are filmmakers whose view is that more old world view. It's John Ford, Martin Scorsese, Francis Ford Coppola, Frank Capra, and there are contemporary filmmakers I think of as having a Catholic worldview, but not in the same way. P.T. Anderson is one. Mike Flanagan is another. Um, you mentioned the ethnic dimension. I think in some parts what's been decoupled when I think of more contemporary filmmakers is the ethnic dimension. You can think that informs. There's an Irishness to John Ford's films and his sense of Catholicism. There's a deeply embedded Italian American sensibility about Francis Ford Coppola and Martin Scorsese's films. And I don't know that that's part of what I would identify as contemporary filmmakers, who I still think of as being informed by a Catholic worldview, but not perhaps in the same way. Would that be this similarly with novelists, talking about contemporary novelists?
It would, and I'm glad you brought up some of those filmmakers too, because it immediately makes me think that Scorsese, for instance, fits this old world
Mm-hmm.
Catholic imagination very much so. Um,
Yeah.
all of the violence, and the hopelessness is, I know, in his understanding, deeply Catholic, and
Mm-hmm.
I get that. I don't resonate with that, but I mean, I
Mm-hmm.
understand the point. I feel like it's an older imagination of what it means to be Catholic, though, which I feel sort of gratefully that it has changed since
Mm-hmm.
then. But every time Scorsese does a movie like that, I feel like it's the old way. I came across a quote the other day when I was thinking about this conversation we were going to have. I came across this great quote from George Orwell that I'd forgotten about, who criticized Graham Greene, wrote a great essay about Graham Greene in the early 40s, where he criticized The Heart of the Matter, which is one of the Graham Greene novels that really deals with sin and grace. A lot of Graham Greene novels do. In fact, my favorite one is this one, A Burnt Out Case. But anyway, um, George Orwell talks about this old worldview, and I think Scorsese might fit this, as a kind of theological snobbery. And he says in Green's novels, this is the quote: "Hell is a sort of high-class nightclub, entry to which is reserved for Catholics only," which I think is really a great way to put it. It's you can't watch a Scorsese film or read some of these chapters of a Graham Greene novel without getting that feeling that it's a glorifying of the violent and the awful, and the dirty and the dark, and all of that. I don't think that's exactly what they intended, but that is kind of what comes through. And I think what is new and different now, and I'll use an example from film. So, Chris, have you seen The Miracle Club? The film?
No, I have not yet seen it. I'm familiar with it, but I haven't seen it yet.
I'm a fan of it. I edit. One of the things I do is I edit a magazine, and I assigned it for review, but then I also interviewed the director, and it was a lot of fun. He's a Catholic French director, and it's a movie with Maggie Davis and Kathy Bates,
That's right.
Penny, and it is both post-Catholic and deeply Catholic at the same time, I think. So I won't tell you the whole plot of the movie, of course, but I'll just sort of summarize to justify the point that I just made, which is that it's a movie that on the face of it, a story that on the face of it is about three simple country women from Ireland, pre-Vatican II, who uh, who by sort of luck and hard work earn their right to go on a trip, even though they really have no money. They're very simple people, to go on a trip to Lourdes. And for each of them, it's their life stream to go on a trip to Lourdes. And each of them, you hear the backstory of why they want to go. They each have a cause, which is the reason they want to go, a very important reason that they want to be in that special, miraculous place and pray for some kind of healing. And the end of the story, I don't want to ruin it, but the end of the story is that none of the traditional miraculous hagiographical kind of healing takes place, but yet tremendous healing takes place. And so you see those backstories towards the end of the film come full circle, and each one of them, there's an inspirational, beautiful way in which completely unexpectedly a relationship is healed or a situation is healed, not the illness or whatever it was that they went asking for healing. Because actually, when they're in Lourdes, they're very upset that it doesn't happen the way that it says it's supposed to happen in the brochure. So there's this way in which I think of it as a sort of post-Catholic story for a lot of folks who are disaffected with the church, disaffected with promises and things like Lourdes, because it feels very Sunday school and not real. But then deeply Catholic, it's like a revaluing of what the old words mean. Revaluing of what grace is, or what healing is, or what redemption is.
Mm.
So anyway, I mean, just to use a film, that's kind of an illustration of what I see as the evolution we've had in the Catholic imagination and the Catholic novelist today also.
I wonder if you're saying that makes me now think of, I've not read the novel, but I've seen the movie many, many times, Babette's Feast, which contraposes this kind of stark Lutheran's lifestyle with the French woman who comes in and clearly frames a Eucharistic scene at the end where a miracle happens, right? But again, not in the way you're describing.
Yes.
Also,
the bountiful open-handedness.
Yeah.
Such a deeply Catholic value and values that are communicated through the simple French woman.
Mm-hmm. So if we've mentioned some names here, and perhaps we ask you to talk a little bit more about them, just your kind of sense of them or your appreciation or not of them. We've talked about Graham Greene, Evelyn Waugh, Flannery O'Connor. Let's start with them, but then we'll move into some contemporary authors also that you enjoy reading, perhaps that reflect this more contemporary Catholic. So how would you describe, those three are usually kind of lifted up, if you want to partition them off of the old school, those are three that often are mentioned, among others, that fall within this dimension you're talking about. So how would you describe each of them?
Well, I would almost take Flannery O'Connor off the table because she is unique.
Yes. Yeah.
So, one of the things that what I've done for my career for 30 years is I work in book publishing. So I can't tell you how many times I've been in meetings with other editors or literary agents or authors and so on. People talk about finding someone like Flannery O'Connor. You can't find someone like Flannery O'Connor. She's a one of a kind. So I want to kind of put her to the side for a second. Graham Greene and Evelyn Waugh, I think you can sort of take in the same hand, because they're both converts to the faith. There's no one like the convert to write so earnestly in defense of the faith. They both were brilliant, miserable people, but brilliant and witty, and wanted to explore their sin and forgiveness and returning to sin and some desperate hope for grace. Both of them. Now, Evelyn Waugh has his hagiographical moments and has his real utter devotion to the church kind of moments in a way that Graham Greene doesn't. I actually find Graham Greene much more interesting myself. Um, Waugh, I have difficulty. He's very funny. He's like the funniest Catholic novelist, but it often feels like it's at the expense of human beings. He's not a generous character. Graham Greene I find so interesting, but I'll say this: I think I find Graham Greene so interesting in part because I am old enough and old school enough myself that I'm interested in that vertical relationship. A lot of people younger than me are, and I'm sure all of you have had this experience in conversations about faith, or if you're in a book club, or maybe even in a parish setting. People increasingly don't believe the vertical relationship. They don't resonate with the vertical relationship with God, and there's much more of a desire to sort of, find a horizontal sort of understanding of our connection to the divine, using that kind of language rather than sort of a vertical relationship. But I still, in the morning, pray the Psalms and look up to the sky, and I think of God that way, even though I'm told by scholars and by mystics that I'm not really supposed to do that. Mm-hmm. That's the Green vision. It's really, it's that classic vision of God and our throwing ourselves upon God through his characters who are involved in sin and betrayal. The reason I love that novel I held up, A Burnt Out Case, it's one of the ones that's not as well known, A Burnt Out Case. It's about a famous architect who travels to a remote place in Africa to live in a lepers colony because he doesn't want to be famous anymore. He wants to leave behind his fame and notoriety and his wealth. And he's really trying to sort of earn his salvation. It's all about trying to sort of earn his salvation. And then someone finally, after he's in this anonymous place doing good works for a long time, someone sort of discovers who he is, and someone comes to write about him, and then everything is messed up. In the end, he dies kind of a martyr's death. And it feeds into a lot of these sort of theological conundrums that Greene wants to explore. Is, what is forgiveness and what is grace and when does it happen and can you ever know that it's happening? And what do you do when you sin again? Because all of us sin again. And in Greene's own personal life, he sinned terribly again and again. So he was often writing out of his own experiences. So, I think of Waugh and Greene and O'Connor in those kinds of terms. O'Connor is really a one of a kind. O'Connor is the one who can write a story, about a bitter old woman who is then shot dead at the end of the story, and the line goes, it would have been good if someone would have been there to shoot her dead or shoot her every day of her life, because the woman only sort of suddenly sees what we might call grace at the last moment as she's dying, and the sense you get from the story, the point you get is that it's a good thing she was shot dead, because without it, she never would have seen that grace. She never would have had that moment of salvation. Her stories are also full of some very difficult language relating to black and white people and the portrayal of characters from the South. She comes across very bigoted and very racist at times, and as I said, very violent at times also. So it's difficult, but I think it's still good when Flannery O'Connor is taught in college university settings. She's been sort of canceled in recent years in a lot of places, but there are real fruitful conversations that take place when people read them.
Yeah, you met. I'll start with Greene. The first book I read, which is what most people read, is The Power and the Glory. And what struck me reading it was the energy of the writing, the urgency of the writing around the character. And you're right. And a character who at the end, it leaves it up to us as the reader to decide, is he a saint or is he a sinner?
Right.
At the
right.
And there's a setting around it, right? If you know anything about the Cristero period, there's a setting. So for people who know, it takes place in Mexico. It's about a priest who's being hunted by the government. But the priest himself is no perfect person. He himself is a sinner, which we learn through the course of the story. And yes, O'Connor, I just posted for people a link here. It's to the PBS, American Masters uh, um, um, biography about her. I'll shortly here post you also a video that just was posted 2 days ago to YouTube. It's a conversation between Bishop Barron, Ethan Hawke, and his daughter Maya Hawke, because they're working on a film right now about her. It's a conversation between the three of them about how they came to Flannery O'Connor and how they came to make this film. Yes, O'Connor is, so for those of you who've not read Flannery O'Connor, right, you just pick the story, right, that most people are generally familiar with or is usually taught, and that is, if I give the story "A Good Man Is Hard to Find" to my students, and I say this is a story about grace. This is a Catholic view of grace. My students would read it and not know. They would expect it to be a story about, again, priests or churches or something happening.
Right.
So that people know it's a short story about a serial killer who kills an entire family, everyone. But it's a story about grace.
Yeah.
It's illustrative of her notions of grace. So could you maybe talk a little about that, her understanding of grace? What is she getting at by the infusion of grace in her stories, and in ways that would not be oftentimes readily apparent to someone who's not familiar with her or her writing, or even kind of Catholic notions of grace?
Well, yeah. O'Connor's real strength is that she doesn't use religious language. So there's almost a bit of a trickery to her communicating these aspects of the Catholic imagination, and then she does it so powerfully because she writes about deliberately wanting to shock a reader. You have to sometimes shock a reader in order to get them to pay attention, listen, hear, or catch what it is you might want to catch. She really framed the struggle to make belief believable. Was a phrase that she used, and she called for fiction that dramatized the central religious experience of life, which is what she saw in life as a religious experience first and foremost. But then it's all the more interesting that she doesn't use religious language in the stories. So this religious encounter, the kind that O'Connor is writing about, is describing the forces that forces a person to ask how belief figures into their life and how to decide what is true in it. And she'll do this with the shocking moment. So in A Good Man Is Hard to Find, as I said, at the end, this bitter old woman is shot dead. And I think your students or anyone who reads it would only understand the emergence of grace in just those last lines of the story. And they'd have to sit back and reflect on it. That was O'Connor's intention. Grace is something that breaks into ordinary life. So, and that was the way that O'Connor looked at it. And she needed to use often, violence and shock in order to not only show the grace inserting into life, but to get the reader to pay attention to
I think of I used to have my students read Revelation, and I think of the scene in the doctor's office, right, where the young girl throws the book at her and knocks over. Mrs. Turpin is the main character, knocks her over, and the girl's name is Mary Grace. And it's that moment, right, that O'Connor-esque moment where Grace confronts you and almost literally knocks you over in confronting you. I posted here a quote for people too from her novel Wise Blood. Faith is what someone knows to be true, whether they believe it or not.
I mean, it's worth pointing out, Chris, that this is the kind of stuff which is the criticism of the Catholic novelist also.
Mm-hmm.
O'Connor avoids the criticism because there's no question that O'Connor can be read by people who have no Christian background, and of course there are more people today than ever who don't have any kind of Sunday school experience or Bible reading experience or sacramental experience to understand a story as having a worldview that might be Catholic or might be religious. So I'm sure that a lot of readers who come to O'Connor today, including readers who are in a Catholic college, who might not have much of that experience the way that our generation and the generation before much more easily had, might come to O'Connor and not be able to pick up on what for her was meant to be so obvious. It's almost like it needs to be made obvious again. But the criticism of the Catholic novelist who makes it obvious, and that would be more like Evelyn Waugh, Brideshead Revisited or something. There have been some essays written by, sort of avowedly heretical, apostate kinds of figures, like one novelist, William Giraldi, I remember, wrote an article several years ago where he says sarcastically, something like, if you want to know the aim of the Catholic novelist and the characters in the Catholic novel and the storytelling, all you have to do is just check in with the Gospels and the sacraments and the papacy and the Holy Ghost and the liturgy and the Mass. The Catholic novelist will, by definition, just use all of those things to show the answers to all the meaning of life kinds of issues. And, there's a little bit of truth to that, but I don't think any of these great novelists we've been talking about so far, or any of the ones more recently either, could you pigeonhole so easily. I mean, it's only the really lousy Catholic novelists that's a legitimate critique.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, are there any contemporary writers you could share with us that you've read that you would recommend, or and share a little bit about them with us?
Well, what I would want to point out would be that, to jump to the end to answer your question, Mary Gordon is one that I would point to. Now, I don't think Mary Gordon has written a novel in the last 20 years, probably, but Mary Gordon is still very much alive and around, and writing beautiful things, essays and things. But she had a novel called Final Payments, which I think is often read still in college and university settings. I hope it is. It's a powerful Catholic novel about a woman who's caring for her dying father, and it's a post-Vatican II setting. This novel was published, I think, in 1978 originally. It's a post-Vatican II story, and this character who's caring for her dying father. It's been a while since I've read it, but she goes through a process of having to sort of reevaluate and revalue all of the stuff that she's learned as a devoted Catholic all of her life, and decide whether or not she's going to own it herself, because her father then dies. And so not only do you see her doing the work of consoling and caring for the dying parent, but then grieving the dying parent and figuring out what role faith and all of the rest of it is going to play in her life as it plays on. So, Mary Gordon is one of them, I think, who has done some beautiful things. But, there's such a wide swath. One of the things that I know, that article that you pointed to at the beginning, Chris, at the end of that article, or maybe it wasn't at the end, maybe it was in the middle somewhere, I talk about how there are Catholic novelists who don't give lectures or go to conferences to talk about being a Catholic novelist, but yet they are a novelist who is Catholic, and it's quite interesting to look at the themes in their writing. And one of them, which is really an unexpected one, I think, for a lot of people whenever I bring it up, is Dean Koontz. Yeah. So, Dean Koontz has sold 500 million books or something. He's one of the best-selling writers of our time. And he's a Catholic, but you'll never, ever catch him at St. Joseph's College giving a lecture about being a Catholic novelist. I'm sure he gets invites to some of these kinds of things, but he would never do that. And you can speculate why he would never. I don't think he would ever even do an interview and talk about, why he wouldn't do it. I suspect the last thing he'd want to do is be pigeonholed. That's what a writer will say is, don't pigeonhole me. Don't call me a Catholic writer, don't call me a gay writer, don't call me a black writer, don't call me, just let me be a novelist, or just let me be a writer if at all possible. But Dean Koontz has this character of Odd Thomas, for instance, a series of novels, which I suppose the category would be horror. And when I say that, everyone on this call will then not want to read them. It's not that full of horror, but one of them is called Odd Thomas, one of them is called Brother Odd, where this character goes into a monastery, The last one is called Saint Odd, which is the conclusion of the series. But this character is deeply Catholic in a fascinating way, even though it's Dean Koontz writing in a very breezy style. This is not a literary Catholic style like a Graham Greene novel that's, deeply threaded with ideas and things. This is more action based with a drive, a narrative drive. But the character has what we might call sort of a sixth sense, or if you have a Catholic imagination, you see it more as he's very in touch with the Holy Spirit. And he has a sense of what is going to happen next. He has a sense of crimes that have been committed. He does his own part in sort of helping to find those who have done terrible things. He deliberately lives a life that's kind of off the grid. He talks about not deliberately not owning a house, and it's almost like he's taken vows of poverty and things like this. It's very interesting, very interesting. So I find some of the writers who aren't the ones you would find at Catholic conferences interesting. I mean, there are lots of examples from Latin America and from Mexico too. I mean, the great Gabriel Garcia Marquez, for instance, Love in the Time of Cholera, and other novels are in many ways deeply Catholic, but he's also an example of a writer who would not be at a Catholic university giving a lecture. I think the battle for the Catholic novel becomes a fight for what sort of necessarily is going to define us. Is it belief? Is it sacrament? Or is it other things that some of these more subtle writers today of this generation write about as Catholics, or that have a great deal to do with the Catholic imagination? I think of, joy and tenderness. Um, I did interview Mary Gordon once, who I was referring to earlier, and I always remember her telling me that she has trouble seeing Flannery O'Connor, great as she is and interesting as she is. She has trouble seeing her as a true Catholic writer because there's no tenderness in her writing, and that has always stuck with me. It's a powerful notion. Um, I mean, I'll say at this point in my life, for instance, I'm so much more interested in tenderness and kindness and how it relates to the Catholic worldview and imagination than I am interested in arguments about sin and forgiveness and grace and redemption. That's one of the ways in which I think of sort of the old school and the new school. And I kind of think of myself as advocating for the new school. And I will admit that I've sat, around the tables, at a fancy dinner a where a lecturer is giving a plenary talk, and it's supposed to be a Catholic conference, and I have sat there with that sort of judgmental thing behind my eyes, thinking, this is not an active Catholic. This is a name Catholic person, but not someone who's in the pews. Um, couldn't we have found someone who's in the pews? But on the other hand, in my more generous moments, I don't think of it that way. Instead, I think of it more as, once you've been baptized, you're hooked. There's some way in which you're hooked, whether you like it or not sometimes, and whether you have wandered away for 30 years or not. And I like to think that that's where I'm at more often. So I guess I would say that I kind of land there. And I will also say this, that if you were to Google, like tonight when we're done, if you were to Google good Catholic novels for teenagers or something like that, you'll find that there are some non-Roman Christians who are on the list. Like you'll find C.S. Lewis on that list, because those kinds of lists usually are recommending books, not necessarily those who are card-carrying, Roman Catholics in the pews observing the sacraments actively people, but books that are that fit the worldview and are good food for young Catholic minds in the case of books for young people. So, the Narnia series pops up on those kinds of lists. And the same thing is true with poetry. I'm very interested in poetry too. And when we have conversations about Catholic poets, we sometimes end up having conversations like this. Are we talking about, people who are sort of card carrying, people who went to confession recently, or people who write from a spirit which just the sense of it and the language of it and the spirit of it is just feels so Catholic in sort of a broader sense. And it's usually that latter sense that we use when we have those kinds of conversations.
Is there an author you might suggest who is exploring the kind, tender approach?
Well, Mary Gordon, yes, yeah, that's a good suggestion. I would also I'm suggesting Dean Koontz for anyone who's on this call who is not looking for the literary fiction as much as popular fiction. I mean, let's be honest with ourselves. Sometimes that's what we want to gravitate towards, right? But you can still get such an interesting sort of Catholic milieu and a Catholic sensibility from this fast-paced series about Odd Thomas by Dean Koontz. Um, I'll give you another example of the tenderness, by the way. One of the great writers from 100 years ago, his name was Baron von Hugel, Friedrich von Hugel, and he was a Catholic Christian humanist and an advocate for humanism. He was someone who embraced modernity instead of being afraid of modernity at a time 100 years ago when the Catholic Church leadership was very afraid of modernity. And he's the one who interestingly said he knew Cardinal Newman, Cardinal John Henry Newman. He knew him personally, and he confidentially remarked once to a friend that he didn't think Newman would ever become a saint because he never seems to have been able to be deeply joyful, both in life and in his writings. He never seemed to be able to experience deep joy. And this is kind of like my remark about tenderness. I wish that we prioritize things like this when we talk about the Catholic imagination and what sort of Catholic imagination we value. I really wish that we would value things like joy and tenderness and kindness in what we look to read, instead of conversations about sin and grace and forgiveness and depravity.
It's interesting you mentioned Koontz too, as you said he's associated with the horror genre. And when we think of other traditional Catholic writers, that's not a genre we tend to find them in very much, among others, right? So I think that's what makes him perhaps an interesting writer to think about as well. Right now, not everything he writes is horror, but he's usually associated with that genre.
Yes.
So
Yes. Yeah. And then in the genre of romance, I think of Jan Karon, which might be a name that some people remember. Jan Karon was writing New York Times best-selling romance novels called The Mitford Years 10, 20 years ago. And Jan Karon was not Catholic, but very high church Episcopalian. And there's a way in which the sensibility, I think, is rather similar. And some of these qualities that I'm trying to sort of hold up come through in the romance genre in that series. So, I mean, these things are, I think, appealing to a lot of readers today. We don't see much of that sort of old world Catholic novelist like Graham Greene and Evelyn Waugh. But those classics are still around, and we keep going back and reading them for good reason.
what about Alice McDermott? She usually gets identified in this arena. Where would you place her? How would you evaluate her?
Well, the interesting thing about Alice McDermott, I love Alice McDermott's work, but the interesting thing about it is that she really writes historical novels. Her novels tend to be Irish, so they tend to fit the old pre-Vatican II kind of classic Catholic novel, even though she's been writing them, in recent years, because she places her settings a couple of generations ago in the sort of ethnically defined Catholic neighborhood kind of setting. So I don't know. There's a way in which she kind of crosses sort of the old and the new to me. But I like Alice McDermott's work very much. I'll also hold up a novelist named Fenton Johnson. You might take a look at. Um, the Man Who Loved Birds was one that I know that I reviewed in America not long ago. Fenton Johnson is a novelist and an essayist who grew up just a couple of miles from the Abbey of Gethsemane in Kentucky, and actually grew up with Trappist monks at his dinner table because his father was a good friend of the monks, and he just grew up around that environment. So he writes with great sensitivity about Catholic matters. And then one of my favorite novelists from Ireland is Donald Ryan. Ryan spelled like it sounds, Ryan, and Donald, Donal. And he's written a bunch of novels, only a couple of which are published by publishers here in the U.S. And they tend to be short; they're almost novella length, but deeply Catholic in a way that, again, kind of crosses what I'm referring to as kind of the old and the new. You get a real sense of sin and forgiveness and grace kinds of issues and topics and characters who are in great need and sometimes in great darkness, but sort of moving towards the light and sometimes finding inspiration in unexpected ways and with grace breaking through. But then you also find some qualities of real tenderness too. And he's a younger writer. I mean, he's probably my age, I'm guessing.
Where would you place sentimentality? And I say that because I think of John Ford, who, in his practices as a Catholic, is pre-Vatican II, Old World. I think has some dimension about that, but his films are also filled with a great deal of sentimentality. And is there a place for that in what we're talking about here relative to Catholic fiction, Catholic literature?
You know, I have a soft spot for sentimentality. It's one of those words. It's kind of like the word pious. Sentimentality and pious are both words that we've all decided are bad words now. I still like them. I really like sentimental people and I like pious people, but very rarely are the words used positively. So I think that there is a place for sentimentality because I still believe that one of the main reasons why we read books at all is because we're trying to figure out ourselves, we're trying to figure out how to live, we're trying to figure out who God is, we're trying to figure out our place in the world. I mean, really basic stuff is why we read books. I mean, otherwise we could just look at our phones and watch TikTok videos all day long and tune out and not tune in to questions that matter. Books point us towards questions that matter. And so sentimentality fits into that. I mean, to me, I mean, sentimentality is about being inspired and looking to the past sometimes to inspire as a way to look towards the future. And I like writers who do that. I think Alice McDermott does that in her novels, sometimes in a really beautiful way. I should have mentioned Andrew Greeley when I was talking about romance. Yeah, I mean, those who are old enough to remember when Andrew Greeley was writing sex scenes in novels, it was a little weird, to have a priest writing such things. And that is a little weird, and it only has gotten weirder given all the sex abuse crisis that we've gone through in the church. So I'm not sure how to revalue Andrew Greeley, but I do remain an Andrew Greeley fan. I mean, Chris kind of opened up inviting me here an hour ago by referring to the Catholic imagination. And whenever someone uses that phrase, I think of Andrew Greeley because I feel like I learned about the Catholic imagination by reading his great book about the Catholic imagination. I mean, it could be that you don't read one of his novels, but you read his book on the Catholic imagination. I mean, that could be very interesting. Or maybe just the introduction, which is terrific. But I mean, he wrote really good novels, but it is a little strange when you get to those sex scenes. Actually, I'll give you another one. If you're interested in sort of the older, old school genre fiction writer is Ralph McInerney. Does anybody remember that name, Ralph McInerney? He taught at the University of Notre Dame for a long time, and he wrote a series of mystery novels. And they're the ones that were turned into that I'm trying to remember what it's called. They were turned into that TV series about 20 years ago with Tom Boswell, Father Dowling. That's what it's called, Father Dowling, the Father Dowling series, which most people just, if they remember it at all, they think of it as a TV series of mysteries, but they actually were really entertaining novels. So anyway, if you ever come across one of those at a yard sale, interesting Catholic imagination in the setting of a mystery novel, kind of like a G.K. Chesterton, Father Brown. Genre fiction, I think, is some of the really interesting fiction these days.
That's word. So thank you, Jon, again for joining us tonight. We appreciate it. This was very, very helpful, very useful. I hope those of you who joined us tonight gained a lot from it. And as I said, I'll be sending an email out the next couple days to those of you here and those who registered for it, asking you about your interest in some kind of maybe Catholic book club, and we'll see where that takes us. So with that, I will wish you all a good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight, and hope to have a conversation with you soon. Take care.